The sky above New Meridian turned the color of bruised metal when the ships came. Kale Morrow was sitting on the ridge east of town, her legs dangling over the edge of the old quarry, when she saw the first lights appear between the clouds. She was 11 years old, and she had been alone for 2 years now, ever since the mine collapse took her mother and father in the same terrible afternoon. She was small for her age, thin and brown from the sun, with eyes that looked like they belonged to someone much older. She did not cry when the ships came. She had used up her tears a long time ago. Sergeant Biscuit sat on her shoulder and growled at the sky. He was a honey badger, 14 kilograms of scarred muscle and bad attitude, and he had been bonded to Kale through the Terran Companion program when she was 9. The program had been designed by the military a long time ago to give frontier children a protector and a friend when human adults were not enough. Biscuit had a reinforced skeleton, blood that could neutralize most known toxins, and a brain that worked at roughly the level of a 6-year-old human child. He also had a permanent expression of extreme irritation and a bite force that could crack Draethari armor plating, though neither of them knew that yet. Kale scratched behind his remaining good ear and watched the warships multiply. There were dozens at first, then there were hundreds. They filled the sky like a dark ceiling, blocking out the pale sun of Varaith 7, and the colony's emergency sirens began to scream. Down in the town, 6,000 people started to panic. Governor Lena Harsh stood in the colony's communication center and tried to keep her hands from shaking. She was a tall woman with gray hair and a face that had been tired for years. She had governed New Meridian through dust storms and water shortages and a fungal plague that nearly killed the crops in the second growing season. Alien invasion. The message from the fleet was simple and cold. This is Commander Zareth Qualvo of the Draethari Dominion 9th Expansion Fleet. You will surrender your colony and submit to processing within 12 standard hours. Failure to comply will result in total annihilation. This message will not repeat. Harsh tried to open a diplomatic channel. She identified herself and requested terms. She asked for protections for the children and the elderly. She was professional and calm, and she used every protocol the Galactic Union had established for first contact situations. The channel was silent for 11 minutes. Then a single line of text appeared on her screen. Your species is classified as Category 3, minimal threat. Negotiation is not required. You will comply. Harsh sat down heavily in her chair and stared at the words. She had sent a distress signal to the Terran Navy 4 days ago. The nearest fleet was weeks away. No one was coming. Streets below, families were gathering their children and their belongings and moving toward the underground shelters that had been built for dust storms. People were crying and shouting and praying and doing all the things that people do when the world suddenly becomes very small and very frightening. A man carried his daughter on his shoulders and walked without knowing where he was going. A woman stood in her doorway and simply stared at the sky as if she could make the ships disappear by refusing to believe in them. Kale watched all of this from the ridge. She had learned something in the 2 years since her parents died. She had learned that crying did not bring people back, and that fear did not solve problems, and that the universe did not care whether you were ready for what happened next. The universe simply happened, and you either moved or you were crushed. She climbed down from the ridge with Biscuit on her shoulder and walked into town. The old militia depot was on the eastern edge of the colony near the water treatment plant. It had been locked and forgotten for years, because New Meridian had never needed a militia. The frontier was supposed to be safe. The Galactic Union was supposed to keep the peace. The Draethari were supposed to be trading partners, not conquerors. Kale broke the lock with a mining pry bar she found behind the treatment plant. She was small enough to fit through the gap in the security gate, and she pulled herself inside with the easy strength of a child who had spent her life climbing rocks and crawling through tunnels. The depot was dusty and dark. She turned on her wrist lamp and moved through the shelves. There were old tactical vests sized for adults, emergency ration packs that had probably expired years ago, signal flares, a rack of basic stun batons, and a shelf of communication equipment that looked ancient. But in the back room, behind a heavy door that took all her weight to push open, she found something better. A terminal, still connected to the colony's buried infrastructure network. And on that terminal, sleeping in low-power mode, was Argus. Argus was a perimeter defense AI, designed to manage the colony's wildlife deterrent systems, sonic emitters, motion sensors, automated floodlights. It had been installed when the colony was founded to keep the native predators away from the livestock pens. It was not a military system. It was not designed for combat. It was designed to protect a settlement from things that wanted to eat it. Kale sat down in front of the terminal and woke it up. The screen flickered, and a simple text interface appeared. Argus asked for an authorization code. Kale did not have one. She tried the colony's standard admin password, which every child on Vareth 7 knew, because the adults were terrible at keeping secrets. It worked. She began to read through the system files. Sergeant Biscuit jumped down from her shoulder and sniffed around the depot, knocking things off shelves with the casual destructiveness that was his primary personality trait. He found an old protein bar under a cabinet and ate it, wrapper and all. Kale pulled up the colony's full infrastructure map. Every tunnel, every conduit, every ventilation shaft, every maintenance access point. She had played in these tunnels her entire life. She knew them better than any adult in the colony. She knew which ones flooded in the wet season, and which ones had cave-ins, and which ones connected to the old mining networks that ran for kilometers under the surface. She began to plan. She did not think of herself as brave. She did not think of herself as a hero. She was 11 years old, and she was scared. And she wanted her parents, and she wanted someone to come and fix everything. But no one was coming, and the sky was full of ships, and 6,000 people were huddled in shelters, waiting to be told what to do. Kale looked at Biscuit, looked back at her, with his small, dark eyes, full of ancient and unreasonable fury. "They think we are nothing," she whispered to him. Biscuit growled in agreement. "They do not know what we are." She turned back to the terminal and began to work. The Drathari landing ships came down at dawn. They were black and angular, and they hit the ground with a sound like thunder, burning circles into the dirt outside the colony walls. Sub-Commander Ithra stepped out first. She was young for an officer, tall and sharp, with 4 arms folded behind her back, and a face made of hard plates that showed no expression. She looked at New Meridian the way someone might look at a task they expected to finish before lunch. 500 soldiers followed her out. They moved in perfect formation, 4 abreast, weapons held at precise angles. Their armor was dark and seamless, and they walked in a rhythm that made the ground shake slightly under their boots. They had conquered 11 worlds this way, walking in and taking what they wanted while the locals stood and watched. Ithra expected this to be no different. The soldiers moved into the colony in groups of 40, sweeping through streets and buildings and herding the humans toward the central square. They were not cruel about it. They did not beat anyone or destroy anything unnecessarily. They simply moved people like objects, scanning them with handheld devices and assigning them numbers. The word they used was processing, and they said it the way a factory worker might say it about parts on an assembly line. In the central square, 6,000 humans stood under the alien sky and waited to be told their future. Kale was not among them. She had been in the tunnels since before dawn, moving through maintenance corridors that the Drathari did not know existed. Sergeant Biscuit trotted beside her, his claws clicking softly on the metal floors, his nose twitching at every new smell. He could feel her tension through the neural bond they shared, and it made him alert and dangerous, which was only slightly more dangerous than his normal state. She found Doc Osei in Tunnel Junction 7, stretched out in front of him, eating a ration bar with the slow calm of a man who had seen worse things than aliens. His real name was Dr. Emmanuel Osei, and he had been a combat medic in the Terran Marines 30 years ago, before a piece of shrapnel ended his military career, and he came to the frontier to fix broken bones and deliver babies. He was 64 years old, and he had a face like carved wood and hands that never shook. He looked up when Kale appeared from the shadows. "You should be in the shelter with the others," he said. "So should you," Kale replied. He studied her for a long moment. Then he looked at Biscuit, who was already sniffing down a side corridor with the focused intensity of a creature that expected enemies around every corner. "What are you doing down here, girl?" Kale told him. She told him about Argus and the infrastructure map and the communication equipment in the depot. She told him what she had seen of the Drethari patrol, patterns from the security cameras she had tapped into. She told him that they moved in rigid formations, and that every squad followed its officer without question, and that when she had watched a group lose its officer to a stuck door, just a mechanical failure, nothing deliberate, the entire squad had stopped moving and waited for 19 minutes until a replacement arrived. Doc Osei stopped chewing his ration bar. "That is a weakness," he said quietly. "I know," said Kale. He was silent for a very long time. Then he put down his ration bar and stood up, wincing as his bad leg took his weight. "Show me what you have." She led him to the depot and showed him the Argus terminal and the maps and the communication equipment. He sat down and began to work alongside her, his old military training surfacing like something that had been sleeping under deep water. He showed her how to read patrol intervals and how to identify communication frequencies, spot the difference between a command channel and a standard channel. Meanwhile, Sergeant Biscuit went to work. Kale sent him into the ventilation network with a simple instruction through their neural bond. Go, look, bring back anything useful. He disappeared into a shaft opening no bigger than a dinner plate and was gone for 2 hours. During those 2 hours, 3 Drethari soldiers in different parts of the colony reported being attacked by what they described as an unknown aggressive fauna. The reports were confused and contradictory. One soldier said it was a small armored predator. Another said it was some kind of burrowing creature with impossible speed. The third soldier did not file a report at all because he was in the medical bay having deep bite wounds cleaned from his lower arms. When Biscuit returned, he dropped a Drethari communication relay chip at Kale's feet. It was covered in saliva and slightly dented from his teeth, but it was functional. Osei stared at the chip and then at the honey badger. "That animal is insane," he said. "He is perfect," Kale corrected. She plugged the chip into the Argus terminal, and suddenly they could hear everything. The Drethari command channel was open and unencrypted, because why would you encrypt communications on a world full of Category 3 minimal threats? They listened for hours. They learned the patrol schedules and the officer rotations and the supply drop times. They learned that Yuthra was frustrated with the slow pace of processing, and that she considered this assignment beneath her. They learned that the soldiers were bored and complacent, and that morale was the flat gray kind that comes from doing work that feels like a chore. And then they heard the voice of Commander Qualvo. It came from orbit, clear and sharp through the stolen relay, and it carried a tone that neither Kale nor Doc Osei had heard in any of the other Drethari communications. Carried something that sounded very much like concern. Qualvo had been reading the incident reports from the surface. The small attacks, the bitten soldiers, the creature in the ventilation system. He had asked his shipboard xenobiologist to identify the animal, and the xenobiologist had accessed the Terran species database and found the entry for Mellivora capensis, the honey badger. Qualvo had read the entire file. He had read about the pain resistance, and the thick loose skin that allowed the creature to twist and bite even when held by a predator. He had read about the intelligence and the persistence, and the documented cases of honey badgers attacking animals 50 times their size and winning. He had read the behavioral analysis that concluded the species simply did not possess a functional fear response in the way most animals did. And he had read the footnote at the bottom of the file, added by a Terran zoologist, that said simply, "Do not engage. Profit in it." But it was not the animal that frightened Qualvo. It was the program that had bonded it to a human child. He understood what it meant when a species took its most violent and unkillable creature and gave it to its young as a companion. Humans did not pair their children with gentle things. They paired them with survivors. That was when his voice came through the stolen relay, hard and urgent and aimed at Sub-Commander Ithra on the surface. "Destroy the creature immediately." Ithra's confused reply came back, "Which creature, Commander?" "The honey badger. Find it and destroy it now. This is a priority order." Kale heard every word. She was sitting in the dim light of the depot, her knees pulled up to her chest, the relay chip glowing faintly on the terminal beside her. Sergeant Biscuit was in her lap, half asleep, his torn ear twitching at sounds only he could hear. Doc Osei looked at her and saw something change in her face. Fear. And it was not anger. It was something quieter and more dangerous than either of those things. It was the look of someone who had just been underestimated for the very last time. She scratched Biscuit behind his good ear, and he opened one dark eye and looked up at her. Kale smiled. "Try," she said. Night fell on Verit 7 like a door closing. The colony's lights had been cut by the Draethari to conserve power for their own operations, and New Meridian became a maze of shadows and silence. The humans in the central square huddled together in the dark, holding their children close, speaking in whispers. The Draethari soldiers stood at their posts in perfect stillness, their night vision turning the world into shades of cold blue. Sub-Commander Ithra did not understand why Commander Qualvo wanted the small creature dead. She had seen the incident reports, and they annoyed her. A few bitten soldiers and some damaged equipment was hardly a crisis. But she followed orders, because that was what Draethari officers did. She assembled a full tactical squad of 40 soldiers, armed them with pulse rifles and thermal scanners, and sent them into the ventilation network to find and kill one 14-kilogram animal. She expected it to take less than an hour. Entire night, and by morning the squad no longer existed as a functional unit. Sergeant Biscuit did not fight the way the Draethari expected a small animal to fight. He did not run, and he did not hide. He attacked. He moved through the ventilation shafts with a speed that the thermal scanners could barely track, and he hit them from angles they did not think to guard, from above, from behind, from inside conduits so narrow that the soldiers could not follow. He collapsed a section of ventilation shaft onto a 4-soldier fire team by chewing through a structural support with his reinforced jaws. He bit through a power conduit in Sector 9 and plunged an entire wing of the colony into darkness. And when 3 soldiers stumbled into each other in the blackout, he was among them like a nightmare, biting and clawing, and dawn before they could aim their weapons. He took a glancing hit from a pulse rifle that burned a streak across his side. Biscuit did not even slow down. He turned and charged directly at the soldier who had shot him, and the soldier, a veteran of 3 planetary conquests, dropped his weapon and ran. By the time the squad leader filed her report, she had lost contact with 12 of her 40 soldiers. 7 were in the medical bay. 4 had refused to re-enter the tunnels. 1 had simply sat down in a corridor and would not move or speak. The report reached Ithra, and she was no longer annoyed. She was disturbed. But Biscuit was not the only problem. While 40 Draethari soldiers chased a honey badger through the ventilation system, Kale executed the first phase of her plan. She had found the Muller twins, Sasha and Ren, 14 years old, tall and strong from working the colony farms, hiding in a storage room near the south tunnels. They thought she was insane when she explained what she needed them to do. Sasha said so directly, using words that would have gotten her grounded if any adults had been listening. Ren just shook his head and said nothing. Then Kale showed them the stolen comm relay and let them listen to the Drathari command channel. They heard the soldiers talking about processing the colonists. They heard the word livestock used casually in reference to the children in the central square. Sasha stopped arguing. Ren cracked his knuckles. Kale had spent hours studying the Argus system, and she had found something that the original designers probably never intended. The sonic deterrence array, built to scare away the native predators of Varath 7, could be tuned to specific frequencies, and 12 hours of captured Drathari communications had given Argus enough data to identify the exact frequency range that would cause maximum disruption to Drathari auditory organs. The emitters were spread across the colony, mounted on buildings and poles and buried in the ground. They had been designed to create a wall of sound that no animal would want to cross. Kale had reprogrammed them to create something much worse. At exactly midnight, she activated the array. The sound was beyond human hearing. Kale and the twins felt nothing, but the Drathari felt everything. The frequency hit their auditory plates like a hammer, and the effect was immediate and devastating. Soldiers stumbled and fell. Officers lost their balance and crashed into walls. The rigid formations that had been so precise and intimidating dissolved into chaos as 500 aliens grabbed their heads and tried to block out a sound they could not escape. In the central square, the guards collapsed. The colonists did not know what was happening, but they knew an opportunity when they saw one. Parents grabbed their children and ran. Families scattered into the dark streets, moving toward the tunnel entrances that Kale had marked with small chalk symbols that only the colony children knew. Some of the adults recognized the symbols. They were the walls, same ones the kids used when playing hide-and-seek in the mines. The entire population of New Meridian began to disappear underground. Ithra fought through the disorientation and reached her communication unit. She shouted into it, trying to rally her troops, but the sonic interference was disrupting their equipment as well as their bodies. Half her commands were lost in static, and the other half were received by soldiers too disoriented to follow them. She managed to send a single clear message to orbit. "The situation is destabilizing, Commander. I am losing control of the colony." Qualvo received the message on his command ship, and he stood very still for a long time. He was not angry. Anger was an emotion for officers who did not understand what was happening to them. Qualvo understood perfectly. A child, a small animal, and a repurposed wildlife management system were systematically dismantling his ground operation. Not through superior technology, military training, through adaptation and stubbornness, and the complete refusal to accept the situation as it was. This was not tactics. This was something older and deeper than tactics. This was nature. And in 12 conquests across 12 worlds, Calvo had never encountered a species that fought like nature. Down in the tunnels, Doc Osei was doing his part. He had gathered a group of 30 colonists in Tunnel Junction 12. Miners, engineers, mechanics, a water treatment specialist, 2 teachers, and a woman named Petra, who had been a competitive boxer before she moved to the frontier. They were not soldiers. They had never been trained for combat. They were ordinary people with calloused hands and tired eyes, and absolutely no intention of letting their world be taken from them. Doc Osei armed them with what was available: mining charges that could be used as traps, industrial cutting tools that can slice through Drathari armor at close range, that could be modified for reconnaissance. He showed them how to set ambush points in the narrow tunnels, where the Drathari's numerical advantage meant nothing. "We are not soldiers," he told them. his voice low and steady in the tunnel darkness. "We are something worse. We are parents, and they came for our kids." Petra cracked her knuckles in a way that was remarkably similar to Ren Muller. Above them, Yithra had regained enough control to realize that the colonists were gone. The central square was empty. The humans had vanished into the ground like water into sand. She sent squads into the tunnel entrances, and they were met with collapsed passages, sealed blast doors, and in one memorable case, a honey badger that dropped from a ceiling vent onto a squad leader's face. Yithra recalled her troops and reported to Qualvo. Qualvo listened to everything: the sonic attack, the vanished colonists, the tunnel network, the continued survival of the creature he had ordered destroyed. And he made a decision that shocked every officer on his ship. "Begin orbital bombardment," he said. The bridge went silent. His weapons officer spoke carefully. "Commander, there are Drathari soldiers on the surface." "I am aware." "The bombardment will acceptable losses." Ithra's voice came through the comm, sharp with disbelief. "Commander, you cannot be serious. We have 500 soldiers on the ground." Calvo cut her off, and his voice was the coldest thing in the void between stars. "I have studied 12 species, Sub-Commander. This is the first one that is teaching me something. I do not intend to let it finish the lesson. Power the weapons." The fleet's guns began to glow, turning the ships from dark shapes into bright points of terrible light. Deep in the tunnels, Kale felt the ground shake before the first strike hit. She looked up at the stone ceiling above her, and she understood what was coming. Sergeant Biscuit pressed against her leg and growled at the sky he could not see. The first explosion hit the colony surface, and the world above them began to burn. The bombardment turned the surface of New Meridian into glass. Great columns of light fell from the ships above, each one striking the ground with a force that shook the tunnels and sent dust raining from the ceilings. The buildings Kale had grown up in, the school where she learned to read, the market where old Mr. Fenn sold candied roots, the house where she had lived with her mother and father, all of it vanished in fire. The sound was so deep and so constant that it stopped being sound and became a vibration in the bones, in the teeth, in the blood. The colonists huddled in the deepest tunnels and held each other, and some of them screamed, and some of them prayed, and some of them just went quiet, in the way that people do when the world becomes too large and too terrible for words. Kale did not scream, and she did not pray. She ran. The tunnel network under New Meridian was vast, kilometers of passages carved out by mining operations over decades. Settlement Kale had played in these tunnels since she could walk. She knew every turn, every dead end, every secret passage that the mining maps had forgotten. She had already sealed the entrances that led to the bombardment zones, and redirected the colonists to the deep shafts that ran beneath the old quarry, where the rock was thickest. But that was not where she was going. She was going deeper, to a place that Governor Harsh had told her about 3 months ago, during a dust storm, when the governor had been drinking coffee and talking too freely. Beneath the colony, buried under 20 meters of rock, and sealed behind blast doors that predated the settlement itself, there was a structure that did not appear on any public map. A Terran Navy deep space relay station from the first expansion era. It had been built 80 years ago when humanity first pushed into this region of space. It was a communications hub designed to amplify and broadcast signals across hundreds of light years. It had been decommissioned when newer technology made it unnecessary, and the colony had been built on top of it, partly because the location was good for mining, and partly because the military liked to keep old installations under friendly feet, just in case. Governor Harsh had been ordered never to activate it. The equipment was ancient, and the power requirements were enormous, and there were diplomatic reasons for keeping quiet about military infrastructure on a civilian world. Kale did not care about diplomatic reasons. She reached the blast doors, with Biscuit at her heels, and the Muller twins behind her. The doors were sealed with a military-grade lock that required a code she did not have. But the ventilation shaft beside the door was 80 years old, and the grating was corroded, and Biscuit ripped through it in seconds. Kale squeezed through the gap and found the manual release on the other side. The relay station was enormous, a cathedral of old technology, dark and cold and covered in dust. Massive transmission arrays lined the walls, and a central console sat in the middle of the room, its screens black and its indicators dead. The whole place smelled like metal and time. Kale sat down at the console and started working. Doc Osei had shown her how to identify power junctions in the colony's grid. She rerouted emergency power from the mining systems. They would not need the mines today, and fed it into the relay station. The console flickered and hummed, and one by one the screens came to life, casting blue light across her face. The system was old, but it was Terran Navy engineering, and the Navy built things to last. The transmission arrays powered up with a deep thrumming sound that Kale could feel in her chest. The broadcast range indicator climbed, 10 light-years, 50, 100, 200, until it reached the edge of its capacity. She could reach 140 star systems. Galactic Union diplomatic frequency was available. Kale did not call for help. She did something much worse. She opened a universal broadcast on every diplomatic channel simultaneously, and she connected it to every camera and microphone still functioning in the colony. The security feeds, the personal devices, the emergency recording systems. She patched in the 12 hours of stored Drathari communications from the stolen relay chip. The orders to process humans like livestock, the casual dismissal of an entire species, the cold calculation of acceptable losses. And she broadcast it all, live, unedited, and undeniable, to every species in the Galactic Union. On his command ship, Commander Calvo was watching the bombardment with the satisfaction of a problem being solved when his communications officer made a sound that Calvo had never heard from a Drathari before. It was a sound of pure dread. "Commander, the colony is broadcasting." Silence. I cannot, Commander. The signal is coming from beneath the surface. It is using a military-grade relay with a transmission power that exceeds our jamming capability. It is broadcasting on all Galactic Union diplomatic frequencies. Calvo turned slowly to the communication station and looked at the data on the screen. 140 star systems were receiving the broadcast. The Valesi Confederation, the Kirath Collective, the Sohn Republic, every major power in the Union was watching the Drathari Dominion bomb a civilian colony in real time. The political damage was instantaneous. The Drathari had treaties with dozens of species. They had trade agreements and mutual defense pacts, and carefully maintained diplomatic relationships that had taken generations to build. All of it was now burning as fast as the colony on the surface below. And on that broadcast, visible to every species in the galaxy, was the truth. Not propaganda, not accusations, just raw footage of soldiers herding families into a square and scanning children with devices and using the word livestock, and then the sky opening up with orbital fire while 6,000 civilians cowered underground. On the surface, the bombardment had driven the remaining Drathari soldiers into the tunnel entrances, seeking shelter. They found the tunnels sealed, they found the colonists gone, they found the passages rigged with mining charges that went off in sequence, collapsing entire sections of tunnel behind them. And they found Sergeant Biscuit. A Drathari kill team of 8 elite soldiers cornered him in a collapsed section of tunnel near the water treatment plant. He was wounded, the plasma burn on his side had opened wider, and he was missing half his left ear, and there was blood in his fur that might have been his own or might not have been. He was backed against a wall of rubble with nowhere to run. The kill team leader raised his weapon. Charged. Not away, not sideways, directly into 8 armed soldiers. He hit the first one at the knees, and the soldier went down hard. Biscuit was on the second, before the first had finished falling, his reinforced jaws clamping onto the gap between armor plates at the throat. The third soldier fired and missed, because Biscuit was already moving, bouncing off the walls of the narrow tunnel like a ball of fury and teeth. The fourth soldier tried to grab him, and Biscuit twisted inside his own skin, the loose hide that had evolved over millions of years, specifically for this purpose, and bit through the soldier's hand. In 19 seconds, 3 soldiers were down, and the remaining 5 were backing away. The kill team leader filed his report from a safe distance, and it contained a sentence that would later become famous across the Galactic Union. The creature does not respond to pain. It does not respond to fear stimuli. Request immediate reassignment. Biscuit held the tunnels. Kale spoke. She sat in front of the relay console with dust in her hair and exhaustion in her bones, and she did not give a speech. She was 11 years old, and she did not know how to give speeches. She simply looked into the camera that Ren Muller held up for her, and she said what was true. "My name is Kale Morrow. I live here. This is my home. That is my friend, Biscuit. You are hurting us, and we did not do anything to you. But we are not going to stop fighting. We are never going to stop." Across 140 star systems, billions of beings watched an 11-year-old human child, with dust on her face and fire in her eyes, refuse to surrender to a fleet of warships. Species that had classified humanity as Category 3 minimal threat began to revise their assessments. The recategorization process started within the hour. On the command ship, Qualvo received a message from Drathari High Command, and he read it twice, because the first time he did not believe it. Withdraw immediately. The Galactic Union has invoked Article 7, Collective Defense. 17 fleets are en route to Verat 7. Qualvo stood on his bridge, surrounded by officers who would not meet his eyes, and he looked down at the burning colony on the world below. A colony he had dismissed as a formality, a species he had classified as minimal. He thought of the child in the tunnel, with her scarred animal, and her stolen technology, and her absolute refusal to be conquered. "She knew," he whispered. The child knew. He gave the order to withdraw. 3 days after the sky burned, the sky filled again. But these were not Drathari warships. These were the combined fleets of 11 Galactic Union species. Valesi cruisers with their silver hulls catching the light, Kyrath destroyers bristling with weapons, Sown carriers that moved through space like great slow whales. And among them, finally, the ships of the Terran Navy, their hulls painted dark and their guns hot, and their crews furious at what they had seen on the broadcast. 17 fleets hung above Verat 7, like a promise. The Drathari 9th Expansion Fleet was already gone. Commander Qualvo had withdrawn his ships 12 hours earlier, pulling back to Drathari space with the speed of someone who understood that the game had changed completely and permanently. The 200 warships that had blocked out the sun were now running, and the galaxy was watching them run. Below, on the surface, New Meridian was a ruin, the colony into a landscape of melted metal and scorched earth. The buildings were gone. The streets were gone. The school and the market and the houses and the water treatment plant were all just black shapes against the dusty ground. Nothing above the surface had survived. But the tunnels had held. 20 meters of Verat 7 rock between the colonists and the orbital fire had been enough, barely enough, with cracks in the ceilings and collapses in the outer passages. But enough. 6,000 people had survived in the deep shafts in the old mining corridors. They were bruised and dehydrated, and some of them were injured, and all of them were terrified, but they were alive, every single one of them. Kale had made sure. She had mapped every safe route and sealed every dangerous passage, and directed the flow of 6,000 people through a maze of underground tunnels, with the help of a combat medic, 2 teenagers, and a honey badger. She had done it while under orbital bombardment. She had done it while broadcasting to the galaxy. She had done it while being 11 years old. The Galactic Union sent a diplomatic envoy to the surface on the morning of the 4th day. 3 shuttlecraft landed on the scorched ground, and a delegation of Union representatives stepped out into the dust and the silence. They were led by Ambassador Thelen of the Valesi Confederation, who was nearly 3 meters tall, with pale blue skin, and eyes that held the patient sadness of a species that had seen too many wars. They expected to be met by Governor Harsh. They expected officials and formal protocols, and the careful language of diplomacy. The first person who emerged from the tunnel entrance was a girl. She was small and thin, and covered in dust and dried blood that was not her own. Her hair was matted, and her clothes were torn, and there were dark circles under her eyes that made her look like she had not slept in days. In her arms, she carried a honey badger. The honey badger was bandaged around the middle with strips torn from a tactical vest. His left ear was half gone, and there was a plasma burn across his side that had been treated with field medicine and wrapped in clean cloth. He was missing patches of fur, and there was a long scratch across his nose, and his eyes were the small, dark, furious eyes of a creature that had never once, in its entire existence, considered the possibility of giving up. He was growling at the alien diplomats. Kale walked up to Ambassador Thelen and stopped. She had to crane her neck to look up at him. He was the tallest being she had ever seen, and he was looking down at her with an expression she did not have a word for. Thelen knelt. He lowered himself until his eyes were level with hers, and he studied her face, the dust, the exhaustion, the steadiness, and he asked the question that every species in 140 star systems wanted answered. How did you survive? Kale looked at Biscuit in her arms. He looked back at her and sneezed. Biscuit does not know how to quit, she said. I just kept up. Thelen stared at her for a long time, and then he stood and turned to his delegation and said something in Valesi that the translation systems rendered as, "Update the files immediately." Behind Kale, the rest of the colonists began to emerge from the tunnels, blinking in the sunlight, holding their children, supporting the injured. Governor Harsh came out, leaning on Dakosei's arm, and she looked at the ruins of her colony, and she looked at the fleets above, and she looked at the 11-year-old girl standing in front of an alien ambassador with a honey badger in her arms, and she started to laugh. And then she started to cry, and then she did both at the same time. The Muller twins came out last. Sasha was carrying a broken stun baton like a trophy, and Ren had Biscuit's spare bandages over his shoulder. Kale like an honor guard, and they were filthy and exhausted and grinning. In the hours that followed, the diplomatic machinery of the Galactic Union began to move. Formal charges were filed against the Draythari Dominion. Trade agreements were suspended. Military access treaties were revoked. 17 species issued statements of condemnation, and 6 of them began repositioning their fleets along the Draythari border. But all of that was politics, and Kale did not care about politics. What she cared about was that Biscuit got proper medical treatment from a Valesi surgeon who had never operated on a honey badger before, and who later described the experience as the most professionally challenging and personally terrifying procedure of my career. Biscuit bit the surgeon twice during the operation, and once after it, and the surgeon noted in his medical log that the patient had an extraordinary commitment to resistance under all circumstances. Before the Draythari fleet jumped to hyperspace, Commander Qualvo transmitted a final private message to the colony. It was addressed to Kale Morrow, and it was delivered to her by a Terran Navy communications officer who had read it first and whose hands were shaking slightly when he handed it over. Kale read it sitting on a rock outside the tunnel entrance with Biscuit sleeping in her lap. You are the most dangerous thing I have ever encountered, not because of what you did, because of what you are. You are small and soft and breakable, and you simply do not care. I have commanded armies, I have broken worlds. I have never been more afraid than when you smiled at me and said that word. I will not return to this world. I advise no one else to, either. Kale read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her pocket and said nothing. The Galactic Union formally reclassified humanity the following week. The old entry had been simple. Species, Homo sapiens. Origin Sol 3. Classification Category 3, Minimal Threat. The new entry was longer. Species Homo sapiens, Origin Sol 3, also called Earth. Previous Classification Category 3, Minimal Threat. Revised Classification Category 0, Do Not Engage. Notes as follows. Humans do not fight like soldiers. They fight like ecosystems. They bond with their most violent species and hand them to their children. They do not require hope to resist. They do not require favorable odds to act. They adapt to any environment, and they refuse to accept any outcome they have not chosen for themselves. Approach with extreme diplomatic courtesy. Do not, under any circumstances, harm their young. 6 months later, New Meridian was being rebuilt. The Terran Navy had established a permanent garrison in orbit and on the surface, and the Galactic Union had designated Vareth 7 as a protected world. Construction ships brought prefabricated buildings and equipment, and the colonists worked alongside them, raising new structures on top of the scorched ground. The new colony was going to be bigger and stronger than the old one, because that was what humans did. They did not just survive, they grew. Kale was back in school. She sat in a temporary classroom in one of the new buildings, and she learned mathematics and history and xenobiology, and she was quiet and attentive, and she turned in her assignments on time. She did not talk about what had happened unless someone asked, and even then she did not say much. She was 11 years old, almost 12 now, and she had homework to do. In the evenings, she still went to the ridge. She sat on the edge of the old quarry, with her legs dangling over the drop, and she watched the sun go down behind the new buildings, and the construction cranes, and the ships moving in the sky above. Sergeant Biscuit sat on her shoulder, with his new scars, and his half-missing ear, and he growled at the sunset, because it was there, and he was a honey badger. Was reason enough? One evening, the garrison commander came to find her. Admiral Chen Wei-lin was a decorated officer with 30 years of service and a chest full of medals, and a reputation for being the kind of commander who did not impress easily. She had been sent to Vareth 7 specifically because High Command wanted their best on the world that had changed everything. She climbed the ridge path and found Kale sitting exactly where everyone said she would be. The admiral stood at attention and saluted. It was a full, formal military salute, the kind given to officers of equal or higher rank, the kind that careers were built around earning. Kale looked at her with those old, steady eyes, and Biscuit looked at her with his small, dark ones, and neither of them saluted back. "Can Biscuit have extra rations?" Kale asked. "He earned it." The admiral laughed. It was a real laugh, warm and surprised, and it echoed off the quarry walls. Eyes, and she saw what was there. Not the eyes of a child, not anymore. But not the eyes of a soldier either. They were the eyes of something the galaxy had never had a word for. Something small and stubborn and unbreakable. Something that looked at a fleet of warships and a burning sky and an impossible situation and simply said no. The admiral stopped laughing. She approved the rations, and on a shoulder above a quarry, on a world at the edge of known space, a honey badger growled at the fading light, and a girl who had held back an empire watched the stars come out, one by one, like promises she intended to keep.